In 2019, I was sitting on my bed, apologizing into a headset as I read some very badly written first draft smut that was supposed to be Twilight with dragons, specifically dragon shifters. It was the kind of quality that a 13-year-old discovering fanfic for the first time would produce, but I had dark circles under my eyes from staying up late all week reading to that friend. There was something about it, even though it was completely empty and there was no villain, no character arcs, and no plot, that somehow kept him intrigued. Despite my terrible lack of craft, I somehow managed to build intrigue and suspense. And for the first time, I did it over the course of 40,000 words and several scenes. Hi, I'm Mia Jarvis. I'm the author of Avernal and Communion and the new Deosphagy series that I'm starting. And this is the perfect channel if you want to follow along with my progress on the Deosphagy series. But today's video is not about the series. Today is just more about me as a writer, a little bit of a more personal look at how I ended up getting into indie writing specifically, and what exactly made me make the leap. Because I did have a background in writing. I enjoyed writing, but never full length novels. What changed, and how did I make that leap? So let's get into it. There was so little that I remembered from creative writing class. I knew how to describe things, use fitting metaphors and similes, and still keep it succinct while painting a very vivid picture. Usually, though, there was only one topic that I wrote about over and over and over again: smut. And it never exceeded 2,500 words. Well, I won't say never, it rarely did. I think 2019 was the real turning point. It reminded me of a time in high school when I managed to form a story that was about 10,000 to 20,000 words long. It was very reminiscent of a post apocalyptic anime, and I found the writing side to be a slog at the time. I rather enjoyed the art form of it, so I'd decided to do a graphic novel in high school instead of actually writing it all out. Of course, the villain had been super confusing at that age. I only wrote villains that I thought would be in an anime, so it was usually a monster or the government, and not really any in between. Either way, the story never did what I was looking for it to do, so eventually I just stopped and focused on my day job, trying to turn that into a career. Of course, my traditional career path has gone pretty poorly: no advancements, lots of entry level positions, and littered with layoffs. The whole time I always dreamed about being an artist on the side, and it added to this terrible dread, like a pit in my stomach, that maybe I was doing everything wrong. I finally decided I was going to do both when I went back to school for my business degree. After all the pandemic was raging, people were bored, and reading was cool again. It started with a throwaway book. I knew the first one would probably go ignored completely. I figured I'd be a nobody for a long time, and I can say, at the point of filming, I still am. So I set a goal of simply doing my best to learn the craft as I wrote about what I knew: dragons, although more of a medieval fantasy setting this time. In 3 months, I wrote it and self edited it, building an Instagram presence and publishing in the spring of 2023. I have a lot of regrets, though. I wish I'd known how valuable arcs on NetGalley would have been. I wish I'd paid more attention to the covers in the genre that I was trying to write in. I also really wish I'd spent more money on an editor, since it was the first book. An editor would have really helped. Unfortunately, I was broke. So, it's part of why my debut has been unpublished since, but that's for another video. Because of the first failure, I was determined not to make the same mistake again. I had to do more than just writing 80,000 words of meandering plot with minimal character development, only a hint of a villain, and more than all the useless filler that made my debut so boring and, frankly, unreadable. So I formed a plan. Number one, I read all the books that I could in the next genre that I was going to write in, which was medieval horror. This helped me reconnect with the proper language to use in a medieval setting without sounding like a King James version of the Bible. I watched YouTube videos from channels like The Cozy Creative for some editing and marketing tips. Just in time world building, I watched for the world building, of course. Rachel Oates and Reads with Rachel, who I lovingly refer to as the Rachels, as well as Unresolved Textual Tension, were great for learning about critique and the issues a lot of writers have, a lot of mistakes that are made, especially with new authors. They were really helpful for my developmental editing. Of course, I can't leave out BookFox. They were amazing for editing, dialogue, all sorts of tips with beginner publishing. Other honorable mentions were Shaylin Wrights and Hartwell the Watcher, especially for dialogue, subtext, and character arcs. Although I do have to say, Hartwell the Watcher specifically doesn't write books. He's more focused on screenplay, but it was still really helpful advice. Number 3, with every video I watched, I approached my medieval horror for yet another edit, specifically combing for mistakes that each video had covered. Number 4, I added more characters. And then I repeated my third step, where I went back through videos, I double checked everything, I made sure that the characters were fleshed out and that they made sense. Next thing I did was not great. I got a little bit arrogant. I decided to ignore some advice, specifically not to add too many POVs when you're a new writer. At least I had a legitimate reason for doing it, but I was honest with myself that this was going to be rough and it was probably not going to turn out well. Still, in order to write that full length novel that I wanted to do, instead of doing a novella for my second book, it was essential that I had multiple points of view. So I would say Avernal has arguably too many POVs. Still, in the end, it all paid off because Avernal is over 80,000 words and is a fully formed novel with character arcs, still not as great as I was hoping for, but a bit better than before. Multiple clear villains, a ton of morally gray power struggles, a complex, low fantasy world, and most of all, the editing was so much better. I recently reread it and found myself really sucked into it, and despite a couple of issues with it that I would love to fix at some point, I'm really happy with the final product, even now, even after some time away from it and writing other things. I think it's a really solid first effort, or should I say second effort. Another thing that changed is I spent a year on it, so I quadrupled the time that I actually put into the book. I would argue some of the main issues are that my twists were still really weak, so if there was any twist at all, it was super slight and vernal. I'm not even sure that it's a twist, to be honest. However, I think I finally figured it out, especially with my latest short story, Communion. That twist hits hard. Maybe it doesn't quite make sense to some people, but I'll work on that as well. I think that'll be my next project. Make sure that my twists always make sense. But that is mostly the story of how I went from just a nobody smut writer to a nobody indie author who's actually published. The whole process took about 2 years, which is, I think, a very realistic standard expectation for somebody who's very busy but also getting into indie writing. So if you're on this journey, why don't you chime in the comments and let me know what kind of videos are you watching? Did I name any channels that you've used in the past? And what do you think about them? I love all of the ones I mentioned. I can't stop watching them. They're amazing. And if you're somebody who's also made the leap from writing scenes into actually writing entire full-length novels, I would love to hear from you below on your journey and how that was. So please comment, like, and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. And I'll see you in my next video.